Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of our Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Stovak from Canada. Hope you like my shirt. Tonight, Acts chapter 14. Hey, it may take a while, but we'll get there for sure. And, oh man, it didn't actually go, so I'm going to do it right now. So you guys keep watching. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bang. There it is right there, Acts chapter 14. What's really funny is, and I love keeping the actual teachers in the dark on some of this stuff because it just makes it that much more fun. They're like, what are you doing, William? They have no idea until they go back and watch the video later. Rabbi, it is so good to have you back. It has been a little bit of a struggle for all of us getting time and coordination handy, but we're back here again, and that's what we need to focus on. And I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say about tonight. So
it's good being back in the dark again.
Oh, it's okay though. At least you're in the dark with me, not so bright fellow. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, well, I'll pull us up as usual with our Bible, if you will, commentary or actual Bible print on the screen. And this, you know what? This shirt is really distracting me. It's you'll see when you find out. Probably in between sets, I'm going to change shirts while you're talking.
I'm wearing the most boring shirt that I have.
Hey, you know what though? It's not distracting though. Okay. All right, Rabbi. I'll be quiet and let you do your thing. The phone lines are open. Phone lines will be up on the screen in about 1 second. And there you go. So if you will have any questions, please keep it germane to tonight's topic, which is specifically Acts chapter 14. So if you've read it, you have a question regarding it, or even you can go back or forward a chapter, but just for the most part, keep it Acts related in the sense of things. So that way we can kind of make sure we stay on track. Okay, Rabbi, it's all yours, sir.
Okay, so last week we finished up a 2-week program that we did on Acts 13, and what we tried to develop last week was the idea that Acts 13 seemed to be a pivotal point in the entire Christian scriptures, because the Gospels tell a story that's pretty much a Jewish story. Jewish Jesus, Jewish apostles living in the land of Israel, they're Torah observant. Jesus says that the mission is to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and it seems to be focused squarely on the Jewish community. Jesus tells his apostles, don't go to the cities of the Samaritans, don't go to the cities of the Gentiles. I mean, it seems very, very focused by Jews, for Jews, among Jews. And then allegedly, after his resurrection, Matthew 28 speaks about the Great Commission, where the apostles are given a mandate now to take the good news to the entire world. But you don't really see that happening so much. You don't see the apostles going out, to the Gentile world. Really, not that much. And what happens in Acts 13, we saw, was that Paul begins really his movement towards the Gentiles. He actually he's had enough of the Jews. He says, look, you guys are not really receptive to the gospel, and he says, therefore, if I forget about you, I'm going to the Gentiles. That was last week's declaration, although he still continues, we'll see this week, to go to Jewish synagogues. But we saw last week that not only does the emphasis of Paul clearly move towards his outreach to the Gentile world, but his name is changed from a Jewish name, Shaul, to the more Roman-sounding name, Paul. And then we saw that there was even a different way of using the description of places of worship. So the followers of Jesus are now spoken of being involved with churches, as distinguished from the term used for the Jewish community, synagogues. And last week we looked at a whole handful of ways in which you see that the Christian movement is beginning to split away from its Jewish roots. And so what happens now in the beginning of chapter 14, this is actually, we're still in the middle of what is referred to as Paul's first missionary journey. He went on several of these long excursions, long trips, and this is in the middle of his first missionary journey. He's going with Barnabas. they come to Iconium, and they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, we're told in verse 1. Now again, that reinforces what we said last week. Why say the synagogue of the Jews? Why not just say we went to the synagogue?
Now, didn't they refer to in another area the synagogue of Satan, and what were they referring to as that in general?
Oh, that's going to come up in the book of Revelation.
Okay, perfect.
I think.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think it's chapter 3 there. But I mean, what's clear is that when the writers speak about, us, the followers of Jesus going to the synagogue of the Jews, well, aren't they Jews themselves?
Right.
So you see that now the church movement begins to speak of themselves, sort of as not part of the Jewish communities, not part of the Jews. So now, Luke is saying here that Paul and Barnabas are going to the synagogue of the Jews, and they speak, we're told in verse 1, so that I guess their preaching was so powerful that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. So this is pretty, amazing results from their preaching. Apparently, we're told a large number, a great multitude of both Jews and Greeks were converted. They became to believe. And the question I think, again, we have to ask and continue to ask is, what does it mean here when it says that these Jews and Greeks came to believe? Believe exactly what? It doesn't spell out what exactly they came to believe. I think there are three major possibilities. Number one is they simply came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and possibly a little bit beyond that, that he was resurrected after he was crucified, and then he went up to heaven to the right-hand side of God. Meaning that it may be that all they were preaching, this again, I want to emphasize, I cannot say this definitively, but this is a possibility, that all they were preaching was that they should believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and that miraculously he resurrected from the dead after he was crucified, and then after a couple of weeks he went up to heaven to be with his Father, with the Almighty.
Do you think that because it does seem to specify the synagogue, quote unquote, of the Jews, is it possible that maybe the Greeks had tried to create synagogues of their own, and maybe that's why they specified whose synagogue it was? Is that even a possibility?
I don't think so, because we don't have any record of Gentile people from the Greco-Roman world forming communities around something that were called synagogues. But we do know that many of the Greeks, meaning many of the Gentiles in Asia Minor, would come to synagogues. These were, again, not just regular Greeks, but they were what we call the God-fearers. They were people who were consciously associating with the synagogue. They were attracted to the synagogue. They were attracted to Judaism. So these are actually just Greeks that are hanging out at the Jewish synagogue. And, it's not really clear what they're coming to believe now after Paul is preaching. I would say that the belief with the least impact in terms of violating Judaism would be simply to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. It's not a crime within Judaism. It's not heresy to believe in someone as the Messiah that's not the Messiah. You're just mistaken. And again, this is going along the backdrop of, we saw that in so many places, Paul's preaching didn't really provoke anyone. No one was bothered by it. No one seemed to be scandalized by what he was preaching. But maybe that's all he was preaching. And then again, if that's all that was preached, we're going to see later on in this chapter, so why do some people get so bothered? Why are some people so huffy about it? But that is one possibility, at least. The second possibility is that he went further than simply teaching that Jesus was the Messiah, but maybe he went further and redefined the Messiah and was claiming that Jesus came as the Messiah in order to die as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Maybe he was teaching that Jesus' death served as an atonement through being a sacrifice. Again, that would be a weird idea in Judaism, very weird, but maybe not reaching the level of heresy.
Okay.
But
Pardon me for jumping this question in. There's been something very fresh that happened today where this topic really hits common ground. The idea of just believing that somebody might have been the Messiah, like you said, is not really a prohibition or it's forbidden sort of a thing. However, I'm wondering is what your opinion will be. What if you have, like today, Christians believing, how do you even say this? Let's say a person who is a no-hide, or who they think they're a no-hide, but they still believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Is that forbidden?
See, I think the problem is that, we're looking at this question now, right, 2,000 years ago, when you don't have all the baggage of what Christianity became. So you can't. I don't think you can take the question that I raised as it was being experienced 2,000 years ago and transplant it into our modern age.
Got it.
Because, for example, when this story was being written, there was no New Testament. So
right, that's a great point.
Right, so meaning the belief that Jesus was the Messiah didn't go hand in glove with the acceptance of another Bible, meaning that people today who have some kind of affinity to Jesus, they basically are accepting the New Testament as scripture, as reliable. That might be a problem, meaning that to change the Bible and to claim that there were books that were revealed by God that were not revealed by God, that's a theological problem in and of itself. And so today, right, when people speak about their belief in Jesus, they don't know anything about Jesus other than the New Testament. And so, what happens today is that people that speak about an affinity to Jesus, they're really, there's a package that they're talking about that involves more than what was going on 2,000 years ago. When we imagine Paul coming into this synagogue, and saying, well, you should believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that's really all there was. There was nothing else that was getting dragged into it that would have complicated the question. Whereas I think today, we can't look at this question with the same, sort of clean lens that you would have had 2,000 years ago.
Right.
So I don't want to sound like I'm dodging your question, but it's more complicated, and
I would agree.
It would require a lot of analysis.
Okay.
So I think there were three possibilities back then. Number one, Jesus was simply the Messiah. Number two, he was preaching Jesus as the Messiah, but in a different way of understanding the purpose of the Messiah than normative Judaism would have, meaning that in normative Judaism, Messiah is the Redeemer, the King of Israel, basically presides over a utopian world, right? So that would have been what the early followers of Jesus believed. It may have been what Paul was preaching. And again, people might have asked, well, he didn't seem to have redeemed the world. He didn't seem to have, brought in any kind of better existence for anyone. The world is still a broken place. So the answer would have been, okay, but he'll come back, the second coming idea. And again, it's a strange idea, but it's not yet what you'd call heretical. Or it may have been that Paul already at this point is teaching the idea. And again, I don't know, but maybe he was teaching that Jesus did come as the Messiah, but he had a different understanding of Messiah than normative Judaism would have, meaning that he's now teaching that as the Messiah, Jesus came to die for sin. And it could be there's a third possibility, meaning that it could be that Paul is preaching the idea that Jesus was God or divine. And again, the problem with this is that if that's really the message of Paul, why were so many previous audiences that we saw last week not bothered by his message? I mean, that's the kind of thing that would have gotten a very hostile reaction in a synagogue. So this is the problem we find ourselves with. That if Paul is saying something that's not at all controversial, why do we have these stories where they're picking up rocks and wanting to kill him? And if he's saying something that's terribly controversial, so why are there so many synagogues that seem to find no problem with what he's saying. And that's really the difficulty in these texts. So again, I just want to say that these are three possibilities in terms of what it means in verse 1 to say that these people, the Jews and the Greeks, came to believe. We don't know exactly what they came to believe. And then in verse 2, what happens right away, but the unbelieving Jews, these are the Jews, I guess, that resisted his message, stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. And therefore, they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So it's not clear, again, as we mentioned, what is the objection? What is the exact objection of these unbelieving Jews? Meaning, why are they stirring up the Gentiles and poisoning them against Paul and the other people with Paul? It's not clear. Again, it's one of these pregnant verses that we just don't really know exactly what the problem was. And also, why would Gentiles be concerned? Meaning, whatever theological objections Jews might have to Paul's preachings, it's not clear why Gentiles would have been bothered by it. So the whole story, again, all I'm trying to say is that it's a little bit murky. It's not really 100% clear.
Right.
The idea that Paul does signs and wonders, is a theme that we already dealt with in the Gospel stories of Matthew. The idea that signs and wonders are really not relevant to truth, meaning that we know that false religions can have signs and wonders. So, again, it's almost like a beaten horse, because it's one of the major themes of the Gospels, that Jesus is constantly doing these miracles. And the implicit message is that they prove his credibility and they prove his that his claims are true. And we know that that's simply not the case. That
right.
Signs and wonders really mean very little. We know that from Deuteronomy 13, we're told that false prophets can do miracles because God's testing us. And we saw back in Matthew 24, verse 24, that even the Gospels say that false messiahs can do miracles. So miracles really are overrated. And then in verse 5 here, we see that there was a whole division in the city, not just in the synagogue, but the multitude of the city was divided. Parts sided with the Jews. This seems to mean with the unbelieving Jews, meaning the Jews who rejected Paul's message, and part with the apostles. Now, it's not clear when it says apostles here who it's talking about, because we always assumed that the apostles were those 12 appointed by Jesus. And then in the book of Acts, we saw that one Judas had to be replaced. But where are the apostles here? There's no apostles here.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to see later on that this becomes a bone of contention between Paul and the real apostles, meaning Paul basically insists that he himself is an apostle that was appointed by Jesus. And Paul is continually mocking the apostles back in Jerusalem. He calls them in a mocking tone super apostles, like they think they're such big shots. And Paul is constantly trying to, defend his claim that he is not just on his own taking the mantle of the apostle to the Gentiles, but he's constantly claiming that Jesus appointed him. This is something that's coming from Jesus. The risen Jesus appointed him as the apostle to the Gentiles. So that's one of the, I think, we're going to see that there's a lot of conflict between Paul and others. He's always getting into fights, and not just with the unbelieving Jews, but even among followers of Jesus, Paul is constantly being questioned,
Sure.
being followed, being criticized. He doesn't seem to get along easily with anyone. And, one of the conflicts is really over the status of being an apostle. So here you see it being brought up that that Luke is, giving him this title, and not just him, but even, I guess, Barnabas and anyone else that was with them are being referred to as apostles. Unless they're using the word apostles here loosely, meaning that, disciples, maybe not technically apostles the way, John and Peter were. And then the question is, in verse 5, when a violent attempt was made by both the Jews and the Gentiles with their rulers to abuse and stone them. So again, what's going on here that half of the city is so scandalized by Paul and Barnabas and whoever else is with them, that they want to kill them, they want to stone them. I mean, why? What exactly did Paul say that upset them so much? And we just don't know. It's a question which really we can only speculate about. So what happens is that they flee, because they have to get out of Dodge. They flee to Lystra and Derbe. I'm not sure how to pronounce these cities, and they just get out of Dodge. They leave Iconium. So we're told that in Lystra, in verse 8, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently, and seeing he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leaped and he walked. So Paul performs another miracle here. And in verse 11, now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Now, this is a very, very fascinating passage, because it gives us a little bit of an insight into, the important question of how was it that Christianity, as a religion that was growing separate from Judaism, how was it that it was able to spread, and really, spread widely in the Greco-Roman world among these non-Jewish people in the diaspora outside of Israel. And we know, again, this is not debatable, we know that it didn't take long. We don't know the exact time that it happened, but we know that it didn't take long until what became standard among believers in Jesus was that he was God. Mm-hmm. There were all these debates. How was he God? Was he, God from birth? Was he adopted as God? Was he of one substance? Not of one substance? I mean, you have dozens of fights exactly how his divinity is to be understood, but it's very clear that just about everyone came to see Jesus as God. And this story here gives you a little bit of an insight into how that was possible, because again, the early Jewish disciples, as we've shown in a number of places, they really didn't think Jesus was God. And so, because among Jewish people, the whole idea of a human being being God is just not plausible.
Sure.
But in the Gentile world, we see here that this is something that people believe. People believe that gods came down and took on human form.
It was common, right? I mean, fairly common, because you have the whole thing with Hercules and with all these others that have the same thing with a human mother and a supernatural type father.
Yeah, and the Roman, the emperors were all deified and seen as God. I mean, we're talking about a world where it's just important to realize that gods came down to the earth as human beings, or human beings assumed the status of a divine being. That's the nature of the world that they were living, and so it's not clear exactly what happened. How was this transition from a human Jesus to a divine Jesus going to happen? But what seems to me the most plausible, and we're going to do this when we read the letters of Paul, Paul clearly has an elevated view of Jesus. Even some of the Gospels seem to speak about Jesus in elevated terms. I don't know if Paul actually ever comes out and makes it clear that he believes Jesus was God in the flesh. I think it's debatable, but even if he didn't, it's clear that Paul saw Jesus in very elevated terms, and maybe some kind of a quasi-divine being, some angelic being, a demigod, who knows exactly what. He seems to skirt the issue in his letters, but whatever he believed precisely, it's very obvious that his readership, because Paul was somewhat sophisticated, he had a background in Jewish teaching, whatever his thinking was, whatever his writing was, I don't think his readers in the Gentile world were able to really understand the nuance of what Paul was writing. And so it's very obvious that, or the most plausible, that they understood Paul's teachings in a way in which they certainly came to see Jesus as God because they were primed for that, meaning that their entire mentality was primed to see important beings as divine, as God. And so this little passage here is just very important for us to understand how Christianity became a religion where Jesus was seen to be God, and it wasn't really a shocking idea to the Gentile church, because again, that's how they were primed. That was their society.
How is it that this whole concept of, I would call it Pollyanity, if you will, has overtaken the church, yet the church fails to see a really major flaw in the fact that Paul never mentions anything about a virgin birth, which really almost kind of like not almost, it completely clashes with the Christianity idea of Jesus being born of a virgin, which makes him, in their mystical mind, as a god.
Again, I would argue, and I've shown a few times already, that in some of the speeches Paul has already given here in the book of Acts, he doesn't go so far as to speak about Jesus as God.
Got it.
He says a lot of things about Jesus, and he could have, made it clear that he believed Jesus was divine, Jesus was God.
Oh,
he never goes that far.
Interesting.
And in this next piece here, let's just read it. We'll see the same thing. Here, he's now giving a speech to these people who thought that he and Barnabas were God. And Paul says the following. It says in verse 14, when Paul and Barnabas heard this, that they were being referred to as gods, they tore their clothes. They freaked out. And they ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? How could you say something so absurd?" And Paul goes on to say, "We also are men with the same nature as you. Don't think that we're God. We're just like you. Don't get that in your head. And we preach to you that what?" And listen carefully. "That you should turn from these useless things to the living God." Right? He seems to be speaking here not of Jesus. He says, we want you to turn from your useless ideas to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. So here what Paul is really teaching is that these people should reject their crazy idea that Paul and Barnabas are God. It's almost like a sermon against the idea of incarnation.
Interesting.
Don't think anything so crazy. And he goes on to speak, I believe here, about the Almighty, about God, maybe what Christians might refer to as God the Father. He doesn't seem to be talking here at all. No indication he's speaking here about Jesus as this living God who made the heavens and the earth, etc. So I think, again, when we read, or so far we've read from Paul, is that he doesn't seem to be a good Southern Baptist at this point. He doesn't seem to be, I think that if you read his doctrinal statement, he wouldn't pass. Now, what's interesting is that Luke here seems to imply that there were like hit squads. They were like stalkers following Paul around, because here, Paul is, has moved away from Iconium. He's no longer in Antioch, but the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there. Maybe they came to follow Paul. I mean, for some reason, we're being told here that Paul was being stalked. And these people came, these Jewish people that were opponents of Paul, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up, and he went into the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. Now, again, I'm sounding like I'm beating a dead horse, but why are these people from Antioch and Iconium so upset with Paul they want to stone him. It's not clear. The only things, that we've seen last week, we saw that the people in Iconium didn't have any substantive problem with what Paul was preaching. They were only bothered by the fact that Paul seemed to be, taking away these God-fearers from the synagogue into his own group, but they didn't seem to be bothered by the content of what Paul was preaching. It's almost as if, we have our synagogue and you're going to set up a rival synagogue and take away our members. We're going to really be upset. It seems to be something along that order. So again, we're not clear why the people have come all the way from Antioch and Iconium, and with blood on their mind. They want to kill Paul. They want to stone. They stone him. Now, what is really strange, and I wasn't aware of this until I really studied this chapter to prepare for this week. I read this story, and to me, it was clear that they stoned him, but they didn't kill him. They just thought he might be dead. And then he was able to get off the sickbed, and he was able to flee with Barnabas to Derbe. But believe it or not, I don't know if you're aware of this, there are many commentaries who claim that Paul actually died as a result of this stoning. I was perplexed by this, but it was more than just one. It was even brought up in David Stern's New Testament commentary as a possibility, but I've seen in some commentaries where it's proposed as actually what really happened. One of the reasons they give is because in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul speaks about going up to the third heaven, and the I guess suggestion is that he died as a result of this stoning, because usually when people were stoned, they died. It wasn't they didn't throw pebbles at you. So one theory is that he was stoned, he died, he went up to the third heaven, and then in the next verse when it says when his disciples gathered around him, he rose up. That's referring to his being resurrected. So I find it fascinating that there are quite a few Christian commentaries and scholars who they entertain this possibility, that it wasn't just that he was injured and wounded, which to me seems to be the most obvious way of reading this passage, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul writes about the fact that he was stoned once. Paul never says any time later on that I was resurrected. That would have been a cute thing to claim. And the story itself, I mean, it doesn't say he was killed. It says they thought he was dead. But I think this is significant, and I'm going to try and suggest something maybe a little bit subtle here. But we saw a few minutes ago that the pagan Greco-Roman world, the word I used was primed. They were primed to see the world as a place where there can be gods taking on human form and human beings becoming divine. That was the nature of society back then. And I think it's for the same reason, or a related reason, that so many of these Christian commentaries could propose, maybe Paul himself was killed and resurrected, meaning that after their belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus, I think that for some Christians this becomes a lens through which they see the world as quite possible. There are even some what you'd call faith healers today, or televangelists, who have these crusades where they go to the strangest and farthest places in the world. I've seen reports of people saying, there were people who were dead and resurrected on a crusade. So the idea that it's on the menu as something that, is not so strange, it's like not, an unthinkable possibility, I think it's because of their belief, the strong belief they have, that Jesus died and came back from the dead. And so I think, therefore, it's not so strange for commentaries to see Paul as also going through something similar to Jesus, actually exactly the same, dead and resurrected. And James Tabor, in his very, very important book called Paul and Jesus, interesting because you would normally name a book like that Jesus and Paul, but he puts Paul first.
Interesting.
Paul and Jesus, it's a really important book. He speaks about one of the features of Pauline Christianity being the idea of someone being in Christ, that somehow the believer somehow becomes almost part of, Jesus in a sense. That they speak about the body of Christ, that somehow there's almost an identification where, and again, part of this is the Eucharist, when you consume the blood and the flesh of Jesus, you're sort of taking him into yourself. So there is this theme that runs through the writings of Paul, where he really does begin to see himself as like another Jesus, that he has a life that's very similar to Jesus. Certainly he sees himself just as Jesus was rejected and persecuted. He sees himself in the same way. So I just think it's interesting to me that you have so many commentaries that entertain the possibility that Paul died as a result of this stoning.
I just had a really strange thought. There's some interesting thing about the whole thing with the Eucharist and with the drinking of the blood and the eating of the little wafer that kind of makes you, they teach you it's like your way of literally becoming physically one with Jesus, so to speak. And yet in the pagan world, even like I don't know the proper terms to put this in, but I've seen things where people like old Indian hunters, they would, like, if they kill a deer, they would eat the heart of the deer so they could become one with that deer. I mean, everything about it reeks of paganism.
Well, put it this way, it's certainly not an idea that you find in Jewish sources.
Right.
Right. It's true that you will find it in many ancient pagan mythologies. It's quite common. But whether or not it's the exact same thing that takes place in other pagan cults is not 100% clear to me. But what is 100% clear is that it's something Jews never would have done. It would have been repulsive, a repulsive idea. To consume any blood. By the way, forget about the blood of God. Yeah, so it's
especially the blood of God. If you really want to go there, my gosh, that's like, oh my gosh, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, the Jewish Tanakh, this Torah, is so, loaded up against the idea of consuming any blood.
Right.
It's such a taboo. So the idea of somehow symbolically, eating the flesh and the blood of God, it just. There wouldn't be things that could be weirder or more offensive or sort of off the charts than that. Now we're going to actually finish up now.
Okay.
That they leave. They preach the gospel to that city they fled to called Derbe, or Derby, whatever it's called. And again, what you'll find here is that they refer to the houses of worship or the communities that they were forming as churches. Again, I think it's significant that we're seeing in these chapters of Acts that the communities that are forming up around the converts of Paul's missionary journeys are called churches, right? In verse 23, they appoint elders in every church. These are the communities they're forming. They're not referred to as synagogues. And so it's very clear that what's happening here, to continue from last week, is that we have really the split off. We have a split from Judaism. It's no longer part of Judaism. This is something else that's going on. In verse 27, skip down to the end of the chapter, when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So again, this sounds like it's a new thing, meaning that I'm going to be on thin ice here, but I'm just going to suggest something. That, we saw a week or two ago that Paul, I think it was last week, that Paul quotes a passage from the book of Isaiah about being a light to the Gentiles, that's the source for the Great Commission, right? Now that existed before Matthew 28. So I suggested last week that, if there was this mandate already from the book of Isaiah that already told the church they need to take the message to the Gentiles, so why do you have to have Jesus telling them in Matthew 28?
Mm-hmm.
And again, here, it sounds like what they're saying is that this is like a new thing going on now, that the door of faith has been opened up to the Gentiles. Why are they talking about this like this is something new? This should have been something that people knew about, after Matthew 28. So I'm going to suggest, and again, I'm speculating here, that maybe Jesus never gave this alleged Great Commission to his disciples, meaning that even in the Gospels, it only comes up after his alleged resurrection.
Right.
He never says anything about this while he's alive, and it's possible. I admit I'm speculating, but maybe Jesus never spoke about taking the gospel, taking his message to the Gentiles at all. It may be something that arose first with Paul only, maybe because again Paul saw he was not being received in the Jewish world, and so he basically says, "Look,
right.
I am washing my hands of you, Jewish people. I'm going to the Gentiles." He doesn't say, "I'm going to the Gentiles because Jesus told us to."
Right.
He seems to be, this is his own thing. He appoints himself an apostle to the Gentiles, and the apostles back in Jerusalem, they don't seem to be very enthusiastic about this. Like, who in the world made you an apostle? Because it seems that possibly, and again, we don't see the apostles in Jerusalem going out and doing a lot of outreach. They're not taking trips to Antioch and beyond. So it could be that this idea of taking the preaching about Jesus to Gentiles was not something Jesus spoke about. It was not something the apostles knew about, and that Paul really comes up with this idea. And we're going to see next week. Next week is a doozy of a chapter, that there's a big contention about
Acts
what do we
15,
do,
yes.
right? What happens with these Gentiles that Paul is converting?
Right.
It's not so clear, meaning that they don't seem to have had clear instructions from Jesus about what to do with these people in the Gentile world. It's a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what I'm going to suggest. This may be the most controversial thing, but maybe, this is one of the great problems with reading the New Testament. We read the Gospels, they're the first 4 books, and then we come to the letters of Paul. And so people often get sidetracked, and they assume that, okay, Paul's letters come after the Gospels, but we know that's not true. We know that Paul was basically writing in the 50s, maybe into the early 60s, but the Gospels are not written until the year 70, until about the year 110.
Right.
So the Gospels come later. And the question is, who wrote these Gospels? And they try to give the impression that they're written by the actual disciples of Jesus, but maybe not. And many, many scholars assume that they were not written by the actual comrades of Jesus. They were written by people later on who just assumed that church tradition became that, these 4 documents were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who were associates of Jesus, but the documents themselves are pretty much anonymous. And it has been suggested, and that's what I'm going with here, that by the time these gospel stories are being written, they're being written after Paul has become the dominant force in Christianity. This is after the year 70 that these gospels are being written. So the Jerusalem church has basically been destroyed, more or less, because the temple was destroyed. Many of them are probably killed.
70.
The remainder go into exile. They go to Petra, they go to Jordan, wherever they're going. But after the year 70, the balance of power changes from the Jerusalem church, the Jewish church, the ones that were Torah observant and knew Jesus, and the church moves, basically. The whole focus of the Christian story moves to Paul and his ministry among the Gentiles. That's where the whole movement grows. And it could be that the people who wrote the Gospels had already come under the influence of Paul. And so I'm just speculating that maybe when Matthew writes his narrative of the post-resurrection accounts, Matthew puts these words into Jesus' mouth about the Great Commission. It's possible, I'm suggesting, that Jesus maybe never even spoke those words. So if I get hate mail, well, I know why it's going to come this week.
Well, I'll tell you, I have a couple thoughts on the whole idea of the Gentile message. Is going back, if we were to rewind back to Acts chapter 8 and 9 and 10, Peter had that vision, with the sheet, and it said all manner of 4-footed beasts of the fields and whatever fowl of the air, whatever was placed, and it said, take Peter, kill and eat. He said, I've never touched anything unclean. And then later he says, well, God showed me in a vision that not to call any man unclean, whereas as we know, at the time it seemed like they would call any non-Jew was considered to be unclean, and you couldn't sit and eat with them. So the concept, I think, and from what I've seen, at least I would say would be familiar to at least Peter anyway. But again, going back with the whole concept of Paul in general, I tend to agree with you in the fact that, well, first of all, we kind of you've clarified before that I think Acts was one of the later of Paul's writings, not the earlier, like Thessalonians, for example.
No, Acts is written by Luke.
Oh, I'm sorry. But it was actually accounting of Paul during Paul's latter days, right? Does that sound right?
So again, Luke is probably writing in the 80s, maybe even later than that, and Paul's been dead already.
So it definitely was accounting. We could say safely that it may have been accounting on Paul's latter part of Paul's life, even though he wasn't currently alive at the time. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and I think that what many scholars propose, by the way, is that, the author of Acts, whether it was Luke or not is not important, but the author of Acts had an agenda. And the agenda was, how do you make it seem as if Paul was in line with the apostles, with the followers of Jesus? Because when you read Paul's own letters, especially in Galatians and other of his writings, you see that there was tremendous tension between Paul and the apostles.
Right.
And, so it seems as if Paul's starting his own religion.
It does.
And so the writer of Acts is invested in trying to bridge the gap between Paul and the Jerusalem church by making it seem as if, they were basically on the same team, and they accepted this idea that he would be the apostle to the Gentiles. And they, as we'll see next week, they cooperate with him in coming up with this policy of dealing with the Gentiles. I don't know if that's really true, but that's been proposed by many scholars that really, again, we're reading a late document, because, again, Paul's letters are written in the 50s, and Luke and Acts are written, in the 80s, maybe 90s even. So clearly, this is being written after Paul's Gentile church has begun to flourish. And, this question comes up, well, how much do you guys have to do with the original Jesus movement? And so Acts is written to create the impression that all's fine on the Western Front. Everything's cool. We're all getting along. We're one happy family. When, it's quite possible that was not the case, that they saw Paul as a renegade. They saw Paul as starting something that that they were unfamiliar with, especially when it came to Torah observance. And we're going to see both in the in the remaining books of the Christian scriptures, and more importantly, in post New Testament writings in the 2nd century, in the writings of the Nazarenes and in the Ebionites, the Jewish followers of Jesus saw Paul as a heretic, as a renegade. And so this book, is supposed to sort of calm things down. And we'll see, next week is going to be a really important pivotal chapter.
Okay, and as you mentioned also with the whole idea of Paul bringing in a new message altogether, I mean, Jesus himself would not have presented anything other than what Jeremiah 31:31 says, right? I mean, there's a new covenant that's going to be for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. How is that worded exactly?
Well, and that's interesting, right? The new covenant it's very clear there, is not made with the Gentiles.
Right.
right? It's made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
But Paul seems to have gotten a different memo. Oh,
I think what's very clear is that Paul has his own ideas.
Yes, indeed.
And
indeed.
yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's been great, Rabbi. It's been a lot of fun. So good to see you in the studio again. Love to get you in the studio one day, Hashem willing. So, but until that time, we'll keep doing it cyberspace-wise. So, ladies and gentlemen.
Look forward to it.
Yes, same here. Same time, same place next week, Hashem willing. And we will see you all next week. Shavua Tov, Rabbi, and to everyone else. Shalom, shalom.
All the best.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד